Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Cornwall Wildlife Trust's annual general meeting, or AGM, as they're often called. My name is Carolyn Cadman, and I'm Chief Executive of Cornwall Wildlife Trust, and I'm going to host this introduction and we'll test the technology before I hand over to trustees who will lead on the formal part of the meeting. You will have noticed by now that this meeting is being recorded, and we're going to pop it online so that other members unable to attend today can see the meeting. So you can see us, but we can't see you and we can't hear you. So if you want to ask any questions over and above the questions that were sent in advance, if you take your cursor over the screen, you should see a box saying chat at the bottom of the screen. Click on that and you can enter a question or a comment into the chat, and you'll see that Sarah behind the scenes has said a good morning to everyone and a welcome on there as well. We have had some questions sent in advance, so we will deal with those under agenda item 7. But I think the next, oh yes, and we'll deal with them under item 7, and any additional questions that come through, we're probably not going to answer them today, but we'll deal with them and publish a written responses on this AGM website. So probably the next thing to do then is to test the technology. As we go through the formal part of the meeting, there'll be some decisions that we'll be asking members to approve. So we need to make sure, and we'll be asking you to approve by clicking on a poll. So we just need to make sure and test the technology to make sure that everyone knows how to work the technology. So we've just got a little test poll to do now. So Pete, if you'd like to launch the test poll, that's great. Now, some of you will have noticed that we published a State of Nature report earlier this year, and these are questions that relate to that report. So question 1, what percentage of species have been in decline since the 1970s? That's 11%, 41% or 61%. Question 2, what percentage of rivers in Cornwall had a good status for wildlife in 2019? And your options there are 24%, 34% and 44%. And question 3, Cornwall's average temperature has risen over the past 35 years by which percentage? 0.5%, 1% or 3%. So I can see that quite a few people have been selecting their answers. In fact, lots of people still going up and down. So I think 75 people have now selected, which is great. Oh, and a few more still coming. We'll give it a couple more seconds. So that's proving that you know how to use the technology, which is great. So Pete, do you want to reveal the poll to everyone? So question 1, what percentage of species have been in decline since the 1970s? Well, 39% of you, or 13 of you, were right. It was 41% of species have been in decline in the UK in my lifetime, and many of yours, I'm sure, as well. The second question, what percentage of rivers in Cornwall had good status for wildlife? The answer to that one was 24%. So not even a quarter of our rivers had good status for wildlife in 2019. Well done to the 58% of you who got that right. And the third question was Cornwall's average temperature has risen by how much over the last 35 years? And the answer to that is 1%. So that's 70% of you got that question right. So well done, everyone. You've proven to me very nicely that you can use the technology. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to trustees to run the formal proceedings of the annual general meeting, and over to our president, Nick Tregenza.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. Right, item 1 on our agenda is apologies for absence. I've got 10. They're Fred Curry, Ian Pye, Joe Jeffrey, Tracy Delamere Tipler, Liz Tregenza, Dave Grove, Sue Holt, Michael Carter, Pam Wilson and Pauline Penner. So thanks for your apologies. Item 2 is approval of the previous minutes and matters arising. So the minutes from that meeting are available on the AGM webpage. We haven't actually received any comments, concerns or matters arising. So I'd like to ask for a vote to allow me to sign the minutes as a correct record. We're just waiting for the numbers to tick up to something suitable. We don't actually have to get 100% because somebody might have gone off for a cup of coffee. Okay, thanks. So we have 84% in favour, and I will sign those as a correct record. Okay, now I've lost my minutes. Okay, so this brings us to item 3, which is the overview of 2021, which is the thing we kind of most look forward to in the AGM. So I'm handing back to Carolyn at this point.
Thanks, Nick. I'm just going to share my screen. So bear with me 2 seconds. Great. So yes, 2021, another unusual year, building on 2020, which brought the pandemic. Yeah, so throughout 2021, we started the year, well, actually I started the year seeing humpback whales in Sennin, which was great. And then we had another lockdown. We had successive television programmes showcasing the beauty of Cornwall practically every evening throughout January, February, March. Then it was announced the G7 was coming to Cornwall. Then we had loads of tourists. We had a walrus, and then we've recently had the passing of the Environment Bill and COP26. So a lot has been happening in Cornwall and around our agenda throughout the year. The way in which we talk about the work of Cornwall Wildlife Trust is structured under 3 headings. So wilder places is the first heading. So we want more land, rivers and seas managed well for wildlife. And it's been really gratifying to see both that we've grown our estate. So we now own more land than we did a year ago. And that's helped by a very generous legacy that we received. That's land at Helman Tor, Calm Glaze and Breeny Farm. And we've also advised more farmers. So 139 farms and landowners have been advised by us, resulting in 430 hectares of improved land management, which is great. So that's just some of the headlines from our Wilder Places work. In terms of wilder people, this is more people taking action and connecting with nature. It was great to celebrate 10 years of the Open Gardens scheme, even better to be able to actually host the Open Gardens scheme this year. We couldn't last year because of lockdown, but that's been going for 10 years and has raised well over £100,000 for wildlife, which is absolutely fantastic. And as well as getting back outside, we did continue with our digital engagement this year as well. We hosted a number of online events, Wildlife Matters. There's one coming up in a couple of weeks' time as well about dolphins too. So that's been really good engagement with people. And the third way in which we structure our work is looking to the future. And that means influencing policies. And there was a lot of work to influence the Fisheries Bill, highly protected marine areas, to influence Cornwall Council on their production of local nature recovery strategies in the Forest for Cornwall. But also the future is about young people, because they're going to be the decision makers of the future. And it was brilliant to see our Yorkshire Beach Ranger project engaging with so many young people and community groups, well over 1,600 young people across the whole programme, which is just amazing, and awarding 548 beach rangers with their awards, which is just really satisfying. And other projects like the Cornwall Beaver Project go from strength to strength. Those beavers are busy doing their eco-engineering works, bringing species back, and obviously people love it. So the Cornwall Beaver Project featured on Springwatch again, which was amazing. We don't do our work alone, of course. We have lots of really good partnerships and projects that we run. These are just some examples on the screen in front of you. But I wanted to say a particular thank you to colleagues in Cornwall Environmental Consultants, our consultancy arm, because the work that they do, any profits from their work comes back to Cornwall Wildlife Trust in gift and aid to support our work. And also to our colleagues based in the Record Centre, ERCIS, which is the Environmental Record Centre for Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. We host that record centre here at Cornwall Wildlife Trust. I'm not going to go through all the different projects that we work on. You can find out further information about those projects on our website. But the best thing about Cornwall Wildlife Trust, from my perspective, are the people. And trustees are going to say more about trustees later on in the agenda, but I wanted to add my personal thanks to the trustees who helped me 4 years ago when I started, and who have been there throughout as a support and a challenge, keeping us on track. There was 5 trustees that stood down last year. We've got more stepping down this year and another 2 next year when they come to the end of their terms. And they've been a really big part of Cornwall Wildlife Trust. So on behalf of the staff of the Trust, I just wanted to say thank you to trustees at this point. But looking at those lovely people in front of you, this was our second all-staff meeting since coronavirus, March 2020. This was in September this year. And let's hear a bit more from the staff about the work of Cornwall Wildlife Trust. And we'll do that whilst I get a video to share with you. There we go. Great. Yeah, brilliant. I can't really say much at this point, so I'm going to welcome our next speaker, who I'm relieved to see. Morning, Craig. Craig Bennett is Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trusts, which is our central charity which supports all the wildlife trusts, all 46 wildlife trusts across the country, and leads on some of the campaigning work, and in particular with a focus on Whitehall and central government. So Craig, over to you.
Thank you, Carolyn. And so I had a few technical problems getting in, but we got there in the end. Fantastic to be joining you all this morning. Really pleased to be with you. And I've been asked by Carolyn to just talk about some of the highlights that we've sort of had nationally over the last year. And I dare say also internationally, I think, as well, through our work across the wildlife trusts as a whole. It's been a funny old year, hasn't it, of course, as I'm sure you've been hearing more about, with obviously lockdown and so on. But I think the first thing to say actually is that the Wildlife Trust, I feel really proud that we used that lockdown very effectively to make sure we took the time to build the links between individual trusts and shape a common strategy, a strategy of what we're trying to do together, the overall impact we're trying to have together over the next 10 years. And so because we all got so used to this way of working on Zoom and so on, actually it became possible for all the chief execs and chairs of all 46 wildlife trusts to be able to come together once a month on Zoom and create that shared vision of the future. And fingers crossed, I'm fairly hopeful and confident that next week at our annual meeting for the movement as a whole, for the Wildlife Trust movement as a whole, we will adopt that strategy. And it's got three big goals in it. One is to put nature in recovery by 2030, which we will be measuring by making sure we're on target in the UK to get 30% of our land and sea in recovery by 2030. That we'll be actually turning around those declines in species abundance, so that rather than seeing all those graphs that we're used to of species declining abundance, actually we start to see them turning around and pointing in the right direction and increasing abundance again. And that broadly, we've got nature working again, that, you know, we're restoring those natural processes, we're restoring those ecosystems. I mean, for example, the brilliant work that's been done, of course, down in the southwest and in restoring beavers, for example, and getting those ecosystems working again, and actually making sure our wetlands are wet, you know, radical things like that, so that we can actually see the natural processes are working again. The second big goal is for us to make sure right across the Wildlife Trust we're encouraging people to take action for nature and the climate. And actually we have this very clear target that by 2030, we will hope that 1 in 4 of the British population will be taking action for nature and the climate with the Wildlife Trusts. And we're very keen actually to build, as part of that, a really strong youth movement across the Wildlife Trusts that can really drive that action for future generations as well. And the third big goal that we've agreed on for 2030 is to make sure that nature is playing a full role in helping us deal with some of the biggest challenges we face in society, whether that be climate change and making sure we really scale up the nature-based solutions for tackling climate change, both in terms of mitigating climate change and adapting to the more extreme weather events that we know are going to be taking place, or whether it's helping deal with and the role that nature can play in improving people's physical and mental well-being, or indeed removing pollutants from our rivers, for example. So we think at the Wildlife Trust there's a huge role that nature can play in helping deal with those issues, and we want to make sure that gets scaled up over the next decade. So we're really excited about the new strategy, and hopefully it will mean that much as all the wonderful thing about the Wildlife Trust is each trust is independent and focused on its own area and does things in a way that feels right for that trust. Actually, if we're all broadly pointing to the same overall outcomes, then I think we can achieve something through that amazing local action, all chunking up to big national impact, and actually as part of an international story as well of tackling the climate and nature emergencies together at that level. So that's one big thing that I think we've been able to achieve over the last year through the Wildlife Trust, and it's an important one to start off with. But what about the impact we've had in the outside world over the last year as well? Well, I'm going to start by just talking to you about the Environment Bill, which just a week or so back became an Environment Act. I'm very pleased that Her Majesty put her signature on it, and it became an Environment Act. And this is something that we should really celebrate at the Wildlife Trust. I think it's fair to say it was the Wildlife Trust that first conceived of this, saw the need for it, saw the need for a piece of legislation that would be focused on putting nature into recovery. And you will all know that, I'm sure, that the Wildlife Trust have been really campaigning and making the case for this for many, many years. So it's a huge tribute, I think, to the Wildlife Trust that that's been achieved. And of course, the way we worked in very close partnership with many other NGOs in delivering that. That's hugely important. And in fact, through a coalition called Greener UK in particular, where we worked hand in glove really with the National Trust, the RSPB, Wildfowl and Wetland Trust, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, so many others to make sure that this was achieved. You know, key components, there's many components, and I won't have time to go through all of them, but you would have heard the Wildlife Trust talking for about over a decade about the need for a nature recovery network. Actually, what the Environment Act does is it puts a legal duty in place to create a nature recovery network. So that's really exciting, and that concept is now into law. A concept that the Wildlife Trust first came up with is now put into law. We also pushed very hard to make sure that we'd have a requirement on local authorities to produce local nature recovery strategies, and that's in the bill as well. So we need to see that being followed through now. And then, as you'll probably know, over the last year, we worked really hard as a coalition, again through Wildlife and Countryside Link, to push for a legally binding target to halt the loss of species abundance by 2030. And that was hard fought. You know, we had to really, really push for that. But we finally got there, which I was delighted that we were able to do so. So there is now one of the first places in the world, actually, you have a legally binding target now to halt the loss of species abundance by 2030. We also pushed hard on the need for enforcement measures so that all of this can be enforced and nature can be protected. And we won that with the creation of the Office of Environmental Protection. Now, it's always the case whenever you win things, they're not always perfect in the way you would dream them to be. And so it's right that I should flag that we're thrilled that we've got the requirement for a nature recovery network into law, but actually perhaps not the mechanisms to deliver it on the ground at the moment in the way that we would need a designation for protecting the areas that are set aside for nature's recovery, which is why in the last year we also launched the kind of campaign for a new planning designation called Wild Belt, which would actually fill the gap that we have at the moment. There's no designation at the moment that's for taking areas of degraded land and manage them for nature's recovery. And I'm very pleased to say we've had huge support really across the political spectrum for that. We've had a debate in the House of Commons where we had over 50 backbench MPs, mostly Conservatives, arguing very strongly for this. It was featured in the Prime Minister's conference speech in last autumn. And we've had lots of, I personally had a one-to-one meeting with Michael Gove recently in his new role in Secretary of State for Levelling Up and Local Communities, and he's very, very keen on the idea. So fingers crossed we might make progress on that. We were disappointed that the Office of Environmental Protection is not as independent as we would like, and we've been pushing hard on that. And we hope that we still might see some improvements there in the months to come, and clarity about the need for that office to be truly independent and hold government to account on delivery of everything we're talking about here. Of course, another huge area that's been enormously important is been trying to deliver the agricultural transition, given that as we've left the EU, what's going to be the replacement for the common agricultural policy. And I think you'll know that, again, this is where we worked very closely in coalition with other organisations over the last 5 years, really, to try and win the argument that public money, public subsidies in agriculture should be there for public goods. In other words, should be there to support farmers and other landowners to actually produce the goods that we need in society beyond just food. So obviously putting nature into recovery, flood alleviation, flood prevention, improving our soils and so on. And that's been a very important argument to win, so that we have something that's very different from the common agricultural policy that was there before. And in particular, the National Trust, RSPB and the Wildlife Trust have been working very closely together on this. In fact, I've had frequent meetings this year jointly with Hilary McGrady at the National Trust and Becky Spate at RSPB, with the most senior officials in DEFRA to try and win the arguments here. I have to tell you, we're not at the moment, we're not as pleased as we'd like to be. We think, we're expecting publication of the details of the environmental land management scheme at the end of this month. And we are not convinced that it's as good as it could be. And we're still pushing really hard on that right now. And you might hear something about that more publicly soon, because we're keen to sort of make that point jointly with the National Trust and RSPB that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to get the right kind of payments in place, the right kind of support in place to really help farmers and other landowners put nature in recovery. So we are going to keep working on that, but it's a very, very important area. And then, of course, the marine environment, which is roughly around 50% of our biodiversity across the UK, and of course, hugely important for you in Cornwall with your 2 coasts. I'm very, very jealous of that. That's really just showing off having 2 coasts, I think, quite frankly. But we're always campaigning for better protection of the marine environment and to put the marine environment into recovery as well. And we had a huge win again this year when the government agreed to establish highly protected marine areas. In other words, areas where there would be no extraction activities and areas where actually we can make sure that the marine environment is really delivering and going into recovery. And so the big effort now is to really make sure we get some of those areas designated over the next year. That will be crucially important. And of course, right up on the list is ones very close to where you are in Cornwall. That will be incredibly important. I did say, though, of course, we've over the last year, we've really kind of got more involved in thinking about the role that we can play as the Wildlife Trust and connecting through to a more international agenda as well. We absolutely want to see nature put into recovery on these couple of islands off the west coast of Europe, but we all want to see that as part of an international story as well of putting nature into recovery globally as well. And so we were working quite closely with Number 10 actually in the run up to the G7, which of course you hosted in Cornwall this year. And I think it's no accident, let's put it this way, when you look at some of the statements that came out of the G7, that you'll see some phrases in there which are quite familiar to us at the Wildlife Trust, again about putting nature into recovery, about the need for us to get 30% of our land and sea in recovery by 2030 and so on. And statements from G7 in one sense are just statements, but then they lead on to other things. They open up other opportunities in international agreements like in the Climate Convention and indeed also in the Convention on Biological Diversity. But of course, we are also very, very pleased to be working with Number 10 on creating, and then with Carolyn and her team on creating the legacy project around the G7, which I'm sure Carolyn has been telling you more about this morning. If not, we'll do so. But that was really exciting that the government, Number 10, chose to work with the Wildlife Trust and Cornwall Wildlife Trust in particular to create a legacy for nature out of the G7 summit that happened in Cornwall earlier this year. In September, I also went to the IUCN Congress in Marseille. IUCN is the World Conservation Union, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And actually, one of the bits that we should be really proud about in the history of the Wildlife Trust is we were one of the 5 founding members of IUCN back in the 1940s. And it is now this extraordinary network of around 250 NGOs, but also governments. The world's biggest governments are part of IUCN as members as well. And it's where a lot of the thinking gets thrashed out about the future direction of nature conservation globally and what that means within countries as well. It's where some of the thinking around 30 by 30 first came from, for example. And what was really important is at the September meeting, there was sort of a thorough discussion about what's called the post-2020 framework for nature recovery globally, which will be taken to the Convention on Biological Diversity in spring next year. And all of that kind of trickles down to the sort of policy context that we find ourselves in the UK. And of course, I hope you will know that we also had a very significant presence at COP26, the UN Framework Convention climate change meeting that happened in Glasgow just in this month. We were there, we were making sure that nature was high on the agenda, absolutely trying to make sure that it was understood the role that nature can play in helping us mitigate climate change by drawing down carbon, and that is a significant, limited but significant role. And we're always very clear that we've got to stop burning fossil fuels, but if we can stop burning fossil fuels and put nature into recovery, then we might just have a hope of tackling the climate emergency. And we at the Wildlife Trust were there making that point very loudly. And I'm pleased to say that I think nature featured more strongly in the narrative around COP26 than in any other COP I've been to in the past, and I've been to many actually. Of course, you know, we never really thought that Glasgow was suddenly going to deliver the silver bullet that would solve climate change. I think it would be naive to think that. And, you know, it's really frustrating that we'd love to see much faster progress on that issue. But I think we did see some progress. We saw some small steps forward, which is certainly better than nothing. And I think, as I said, I think nature featured much more strongly than it has at any of those climate meetings before. So where do we find ourselves looking forward across the next decade? You know, what are my hopes and fears, if you like? Well, my hopes are that the Wildlife Trust movement can work together more closely than ever before, that we can actually really make sure we're aligned to make sure that fantastic local impact that we're having also really adds up to national impact, because this is the decade where we've got to turn things around. This is the decade where we've got to put nature in recovery, both in Cornwall, across the UK and internationally. So it's incredibly important to do that. And it's also the decade where, of course, we've got to turn things around on tackling the climate emergency, and those two are inextricably linked. You know, we have no hope of tackling runaway climate change unless we put nature into recovery. We have no hope of putting nature in recovery if actually the planet keeps warming, and that, of course, threatens particularly our rarest and most vulnerable wildlife species, and threatens nature and our wetlands and so on. So we have to be doing those together. But, you know, I feel incredibly positive at the moment about the place where the Wildlife Trusts are collectively. What's been great is over the last little while, I've been able to start getting out and about and seeing some of the work of Trust on the ground. I've made 2 or 3 attempts to try and get down to Cornwall, and they all got cancelled because of blooming lockdowns that popped up just before I was about to come down. But I will absolutely be coming down as soon as I can, probably in spring next year, hopefully. And I can't wait to visit and see the work you're doing, the brilliant work you're doing down in Cornwall Wildlife Trust as well. And I hope I get a chance to meet as many of you as possible when I do come. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Craig. And I know you're a busy man. You've got to hop over the border to Devon to take part in Devon Wildlife Trust's AGM today. Obviously, the Southwest is doing AGMs all on the same day. So thank you for coming. Thanks for joining us. And we'll see you next year.
Not at all. Thank you. Right. Take care.
Thank you. Cheers. Great. So next thing is to hand back to Nick Tregenza, President of Cornwall Wildlife Trust.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that was a brilliant and uplifting presentation by Craig there. And I never knew that the Wildlife Trusts were one of the 4 founders of the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. I was going to sort of put the present situation in a personal context, which comes from 40 plus years as one of your trustees. And I have to say, today I find the global climate and biodiversity crises decidedly overwhelming, and feel despairing of the difficulty humanity has in coming together around this. Looking back, I actually felt the same in the 70s. Then I was a member of Doctors in Overpopulation and of Friends of the Earth, and a subscriber to Towards Survival, a discussion journal that focused on these long-term issues. It didn't itself survive very long, and I made a move in line with the mantra of the time: think globally, act locally. That move was to become more active locally within the Cornwall Naturalist Trust, as it was then called. Actually, up to the 70s, the Trust was essentially on the back foot, engaged in a rearguard battle against habitat destruction, land drainage, and pesticide pollution. We increasingly encountered the need for education. Conservation was still a word that had to be justified in every interview, and biodiversity had not yet been invented. But we were campaigning locally and with the wildlife nationally for proactive, positive legislation and policies, and there was progress, although always distressingly slow. Now, as you've heard from Craig and Carolyn, we're very much on the front foot. We have excellent professional leadership when we're bigger and better organised to take up the challenges, and none too soon, because we are in the biggest challenge by far in the trust life, and it will dominate its future for many years. As Craig said, this is the critical decade, and you've heard from Craig of the really significant national policy wins that have been made in the last few years, and we can feel really proud of what the trusts are doing. And just particularly flag up again the Trust 30 by 30 campaign, which I think is a really valuable target along the way. The challenge is absolutely global, but intensely relevant locally and personally. Many small businesses, mine included, need to buy some carbon offsetting, and that has globally been an area of greenwash and sometimes fraud, excuse me, and has at times trashed biodiversity along the way. So for us, the integrity and the verifiability of the Wilder Carbon project that's been set up by a group of wildlife trusts is exactly what we need as a way to buy offsetting. Overwhelming is certainly the word for the adaptations that face small farmers. For many, their frame of reference is rapidly turning upside down. So I particularly value the great unsung work done with farmers by CWT staff in upstream thinking, the Penrith Landscape Project, and other contexts. And we can now see that the changes needed in fishing are actually even greater. Bottom trawling releases a similar amount of CO2 as global aviation did even before the pandemic. The problem is that churning the seabed interrupts the major route by which organic matter becomes locked into new deposits of what will become coal, oil, or gas. Politicians need support or more to motivate them to tackle this issue. And part of the more will be evidence of the benefits to both marine ecosystems and fisheries of the regeneration of the small animal-made features on the seabed in which juvenile fish can thrive where trawling ceases. Offshore floating wind power projects actually may give valuable demonstration of these benefits, and we're likely to have them close to us here. And they could provide excess power in windy times to generate hydrogen. More directly, the Trust is working, as you've already heard, both nationally and locally, to get highly protected marine areas operational and to ban bottom trawling in marine protected areas, and is working with fishermen here to change to more sustainable fishing practices. So, scary though the situation is, I do feel actually surprisingly cheered by the role that our Trust is playing now and is rapidly developing. It's acting both locally and nationally with the wildlife trusts, and I think it absolutely deserves all the support you have given it and can give it in the future. Yeah, thank you. So at this point, I hand over to Oliver Blunt, who can bring us up to date on changes in the council, now the board, and the accounts. Over to you, Oliver.
Nick, thank you. Yeah, of course, I'm here as treasurer to speak to the annual accounts for the last fiscal year end. But before I do that, because I'm quite new to the trust and new to the membership, I thought I would just say a few words, Nick, as you suggested, about one or two changes at the board, but also a personal introduction, shall I say. Last year at the AGM, you'll recall that Paul Coyne stepped down as treasurer and is retiring as a trustee this year. I took over the treasurer role from Paul after last year's AGM, having been co-opted as a trustee last summer, and hence my role in today's AGM. This is going to be a short stay for me as treasurer. As many of you know, our chairman, Stephen Warman, is retiring from that role today, and I've been asked by the trustees to take over as chairman from Stephen. In order to ensure business continuity, Mark Woodbridge, who stands for election today, having been co-opted by the board earlier this year, will be taking over from me as treasurer. Just some thoughts on a rather more personal note, if I may. I live between St. Breward and Camelford in a parcel of land which borders the River Camel and its tributary, the Stannon, which runs off Bodmin Moor. It seems to me very like a perfect piece of the middle of nowhere, and it's a very happy, lovely place. We found the house and some outbuildings in a state of dereliction about 25 years ago, and my wife and I have taken on a very long-term upgrade project, which is very much still work in progress. A couple of years ago, when I was told by my then employer that I was rather surplus to requirements, I came down to live in Cornwall full time. I've taken the farm back in hand, and I'm thinking about a different set of priorities, trying to develop an understanding of the concepts of restoration or conservation-based land management. I don't have a farming or ecology background. I put myself rather more in the enthusiastic amateur category, but I do hope that a 40-year career, both as an army officer and as an emerging markets banker, has taught me a few useful things at least. Nevertheless, I've got a lot to learn in working with Cheryl, Callum and their teams at the Wildlife Trust, and with Natasha and her team at CEC. I'm very grateful to my fellow trustees and to Carolyn and her management team for supporting me in this new role. And I look forward in turn to supporting the Trust and the Wildlife Trust movement through what I believe will be some challenging but exciting years. And I look forward with optimism to what we can achieve together. I just wanted to comment on the word optimism. We've heard from Craig and from Nick some thoughts about the bigger picture. I feel optimistic, despite possibly some slightly mixed messages, particularly at the end of the COP26 meeting in Glasgow. But closer to home, I feel that that optimism is justified. That there's a plan, that there's momentum. We have a massive amount of support from Craig and the Wildlife Trust movement. There's a fantastic team at CWT and a really capable group of trustees, and with a number of new trustees coming on board who are really excellent, and that's all good news. Nothing, of course, is really possible without all the thousands of volunteers who do so much work, and of course, indeed, the membership, all the members. So perhaps just a huge thank you from me to all of you. I've got to talk about some numbers. Carolyn, you got some slides. Oh, brilliant, thank you. This is just a cover slide. These are extracts from our annual review and the full group of financial statements for the Wildlife Trust and CEC are on the website. Slide 2, please. You beat me to it. Thank you. This is a statement of financial activities. The slide shows a summarized version of our statement of financial activities for the year end 28th February 21, with the previous year's figures also shown for comparison. The current year's figures are split into unrestricted and restricted funds. Unrestricted funds are given to support the trust, with usually no designation as to how they're spent. Restricted funds are given to the trust for specific purposes, usually specified by the funders. For example, conservation projects like Penwith Landscape Partnership and upstream thinking projects currently running. The statement shows that the group income for the year was £4.6 million and expenditure 4.1 million, hence a surplus of £506,480. This is a result of a surplus of 101, just over 101,000 in restricted funds and just over 405,000 in unrestricted funds. As a result, the total unrestricted funds at the fiscal year end stood at £1.9 million compared to 1.5 million last year. And restricted funds rose from 6.46 million to 6.56 million. And when combined, our total funds are now almost 8.5 million. Overall expenditure is at a similar level to the previous year. However, income is slightly higher. This is predominantly due to the receipt of coronavirus-related support grants and a bigger surplus from consultancy work. Of the expenditure for the year, if we exclude consultancy expenses as they relate directly to consultancy income, then 87% of our expenditure was on nature conservation, with the remaining 13% relating to things like fundraising and publicity in order to secure that future income. Thank you, Carolyn. Balance sheet. The top line of the balance sheet summarizes our fixed assets. These are assets owned by the trust, including all of our nature reserves, which make up a large portion of the total of £5 million. This is an increase on last year of over £500,000 and reflects our spending on new pieces of land such as the Carnglaze Farm and Brainy Farm, made possible by generous legacy gifts and wills received recently. The next section shows our net current assets of £3.6 million. This figure is arrived at by subtracting the creditors due in 1 year figure of 420,000 from the current assets figure of 4 million. Creditors are defined as anyone we owe money to and are split into two sections. One being payments due within 1 year of the reporting date, and the other being payments due in 1 or more years, for example, long-term loans or hire purchase agreements. And then current assets are largely made up of debtors, being money owed to us but not yet received, and cash in the bank. To arrive at the net assets figure, we then subtract creditors due after 1 year from the combined total of fixed assets and net current assets, and arrive at the total funds of just under 8.5 million, the same total as shown at the bottom of the previous slide, the statement of financial activities. The final section splits out the total funds figure on the bottom line into restricted and unrestricted funds. The unrestricted funds are also split into 3 categories, namely the general unrestricted funds, designated funds, and the revaluation reserve. They are also broken down in the pie charts on the right of the screen. Designated funds are pots of money that, although technically unrestricted, trustees have set aside for certain projects and therefore shouldn't be spent on anything else unless undesignated. The revaluation reserve reflects small gains or losses on investments over the years. The general funds are any unrestricted funds not already included in the other 2 subcategories. These funds can be used for any purpose in line with the trust's aims and objectives. The surplus in the 2021 financial year has increased the general funds balance to £494,000. Looking ahead, our financial report to next year's AGM will look a bit different, as our fiscal year end 2022 accounts will cover a 13-month period. We're moving that from February to the end of to 31st of March. This is going to bring our financial year in line with the majority of charities and companies, including most of our grant funders, which will make things much easier to procure funding bids and to manage internally. An added bonus, of course, of this is that we'll no longer have to change all our templates from the 28th to the 29th of February every time there's a leap year. In terms of looking forward to the end of this year, our latest management accounts forecast that we'll make a small unrestricted surplus in the current year, so on track as an overall comment. That I think is my wrap up of the accounts for the year. Thank you for putting the slides up, Carolyn. I think will need to pass over to Jill Saunders now, if that's the right thing to do, as on secretary to proceed with voting, etc.
Thanks very much, Oliver. Yes, at this point, my first task of the day is to recommend to you and ask you by vote to adopt those annual accounts. And these are proposed by Oliver and seconded by a fellow trustee, Stafford Sumner. Your voting panel is up now, so if you would please vote. And thank you, Pete, for putting up the results. And yes, for adoption is 97% with 3% of abstentions. So the annual accounts have been passed and adopted. At this point, we come on to agenda item 6. And this is me presenting to you our new draft Articles of Association. This includes 2 resolutions. The first one is to adopt a draft set of Articles of Association for the Trust, and the second resolution is to change the name of the Trust. The papers dealing with these changes were emailed to members who registered to attend this AGM, and they've been subsequently posted on the AGM pages of the website that Carolyn mentioned earlier. So I'm hoping you've all had an opportunity to read through the drafts. And what I will do in a moment is just set out briefly the background to the changes that we've proposed and to explain what it is you're going to be voting on shortly. Before I do so, I should mention that there were no questions specifically relating to the drafting of these documents submitted before the meeting. But should you have any questions as we go along, please use the chat box facility. And if these are simple matters, I will try to deal with them at the end of this presentation. But otherwise, as Carolyn explained earlier, we will take these questions away and come back to you with detailed answers. Just to explain briefly what the articles are, these are the Trust's governing documents. These set out what, as a charity, the Trust is here to do, how we'll do it, and to make sure that we are complying with all the relevant legislation and best practice for the charitable sector. So the articles, in effect, serve as both a framework and the foundation for the governance of the Trust as a membership charity. They follow from our charitable objects that set out the public benefit that we'll deliver. At this point, you might have been wondering why we chose to carry out this particular exercise at this point. And this is, apart from giving me something to do in lockdown, the fact that our current articles actually date from 1963. which for quite a lot of us is a very long time ago, not just in terms of the evolution of charity law and practice, but also in terms of what a wildlife charity currently is actually all about. And we're coming up to the Trust's 60th anniversary next year. And so both the council and the board, the council and the management team felt that the time had come to re-articulate our charitable purpose, placing it in the contemporary context, and to reshape our governance in line with best practice in the sector. So doing this, in drawing up the documents that you have before you, we've worked closely with our legal advisors, and our aim has been to achieve an expression of our charitable objects that will both meet with the Charity Commission's approval, and they must be submitted for their approval, and properly articulate what we're about in a draft that will be both durable and flexible, because we don't want to be changing them on a regular basis. We want this to carry us forward as we move into our new strategic objectives and take forward all the work that you've been hearing about. Now, we know that changing the name may come as a surprise to you, but by changing our registered name, formerly the Cornwall Trust for Nature Conservation, to Cornwall Wildlife Trust, we're making it clear who we are, what we do, and we're working under the title by which, in effect, we are broadly known and recognised. Our updated governance structure is based on the relevant Charity Commission template for our type of charity. And in effect, it modernises the way that our governing council, which from now on will be referred to as the Board of Directors, is constituted, elected, and carries out its various responsibilities. I don't propose going through the document line by line, otherwise you'll be here to the middle of next week, but I shall highlight the main changes that may be of interest to you. And of course, if you have any more questions about these, you can always come back to us afterwards. As trustees, we're now referred to as directors, and the governing council becomes the board. The number of directors is set at a minimum of 10 and a max of 15. The quorum for members meeting, which we have happily met today, is 20. The members' meetings will in future be chaired by the chair of the board, and the role of president, Nick retires as our last ever formally elected president. This will no longer be a trustee role. Key officer roles, mine is on secretary, Oliver's currently as on treasurer, will be filled by appointments made by the board rather than by direct election by the membership, although trustees will continue to be elected by the membership, as you're going to be doing later on today. There's now full provision for electronic communications and meetings such as today. The board will have a general power of delegation to give responsibilities to subcommittees and a general power to make its own detailed rules for the conduct of its business. In practice, this will take the form of a governance manual, all the nitty-gritty of how we do what we do and how we do it. Finally, before I move on to asking for a vote on the resolution to adopt these changes, I should explain that this is the second stage of a process. The change of name and the updated articles are first adopted by the trustees, and this we did earlier in the year. They are now put forward for approval by you, the membership. And the last step, and this may take a few weeks or a few months, they must be approved and registered with the Charity Commission. So they'll be dated and formally posted up on the website once that process has been completed. At this point, I will just check and see if there's any questions in the chat box. Have you noted anything, Carolyn?
No, there's no questions in the chat box.
Fine. Okay, there are two questions that I am going to be moving on to under item 7. So we haven't forgotten about those, but now we move on to the 2 votes on the 2 resolutions I described earlier. So I now commend resolution 1 to you for approval, and this has been proposed by Lucy Jewson and seconded by Charlie David. And this is resolution 1 to adopt the draft set of updated articles of association for the trust. And the vote box is up now. If you would place your votes, please. Thanks, Pete. And we have the results of the vote: 89% in favour, 3% no, and 8% abstention. So the outcome of the vote is that these draft articles have been adopted. If we can go on to vote 2, please, Pete. This is the resolution to change the name of the trust to Cornwall Wildlife Trust. Thank you. I have the results, which is a 100% vote in favour of the adoption of the changed name, and this section of the meeting has concluded with both resolutions passed by the membership. At that point, I move on to the 2 pre-submitted questions that were mentioned earlier. This is item 7 on your agenda. And if you can bear with a little rustling of papers, I'm going to be reading those questions to you so you know exactly what was asked beforehand. Thank you, Vernon White, for the 2 questions that you've put through. The first question is as follows. Page 9 of the Wild Cornwall magazine, winter 2021, says the Trust has had an environmental action plan since 2003. I can't find the plan on the website. Can more be done to make the plan better known and, if possible, involve members in reviewing and implementing it, possibly by a citizens' assembly process? Start with the first point. Yes, we'll certainly share more details of the Trust's environmental action plan online, and I believe that's in hand. I think I should say more generally, we encourage and welcome input from our members, and our email newsletter, which I would commend to you, includes details of opportunities to contribute to the Trust's work. For example, this month there's been 3 face-to-face workshops, something of a new thing in the post-lockdown period, which has enabled members to offer views directly on the development of our new strategy. And that new strategy is obviously going to be the foundation of our work for the next few years. And this is a particularly important area, we feel, of membership input. So we're very grateful to everybody that put in views and attended. If you haven't done so already, I'd encourage you to sign up to the email newsletter. I believe Sarah's going to post up the link to that. I think it's in the chat box now. And this is the best way to make sure that you don't miss out on invitations to events such as the strategy consultation, and to give you other opportunities to join in with things that we know you're going to want to contribute to. For data protection reasons, we have to have your active, explicit sign up to receipt of the regular mailings to us. So I'd reiterate, If you haven't done so already, it would be great if you could sign up. I'll now go on to the second question, and it goes as follows. The Articles of Association say to advance the education of the public in conservation, protection and improvement of the physical and natural environment and the principles and practices for sustainable development and biodiversity conservation. Could the Trust do more, quote, to advance the education of the public in conservation? I mean by this adult education, and here I'm reading directly from the question. I think the quick answer to that is yes. And I think it's fair to say that we could always look to do more to educate. And I think we mean educate in the broadest sense of the term. People of all ages and at all stages of their lives and their engagement with the Trust. We're about to start a new initiative that will build a network of well-informed and inspiring volunteer speakers whose role it will be to get out and about and spread the word about the importance of Cornwall's wildlife and wild places, and to build a greater understanding and engagement with our work. Now, our aim is to build and maintain this network, which will be the voice of the Wildlife Trust out and about, educating and delivering talks to adult community groups as well as schools and other establishments. I think it would be great if we could get more of our members out there telling the Trust story and building an understanding, an active understanding about what conservation is all about. If we're going to get 1 in 4 people active and engaged in working for nature, we've got to start talking to them. And we believe that this is the best start we can make. And we're recruiting volunteers now. So if you'd be interested, please get in touch with Marta, who is the Community Fundraising and Events Manager. And Sarah is going to put up her email address in a moment in the chat box with a link to some more information about these volunteer speakers' role. And if you'd be interested, please do get in touch and have a chat about what's involved. At that point, I'll just double check with Carolyn that we haven't got any further questions.
No further questions.
No further questions. Thanks very much. And at that point, I'll mute myself and pass back to Nick.
Okay, thanks, Jill. Yeah, so this is item 8, the elections. And we have 4 trustees standing down having reached the maximum term. That's Stephen Warman, who as chair carried a particularly heavy workload through the pandemic, and who's brought an unfailing sense of humour and deep experience to the work. Paul Coyne, who was treasurer with an awesome grip on the whole financial picture of the Trust and CEC. Steve Crummey, who chaired the ERCIS advisory board, excuse me, through the strangely turbulent waters of biological recording. And Mark Nicholson, who's with us now, whose period in harness was by far the longest. And Mark was education officer as a member of staff, and subsequently as a trustee chaired the board with wonderful clarity. We've also lost Ian Pye, who has resigned, having brought a sharp legal mind to bear on so many issues, worked mightily through the pandemic, and also chairing the board of CEC. I also retire as president. I've managed to exceed the new maximum stay for a trustee by more than 30 years. For me, the Trust has provided a wonderful opportunity to contribute to conserving the natural world we all love. And it's opened up astonishing possibilities that have actually greatly changed my life. And the people, the staff and the fellow volunteers, the members of the board have been a joy to work with. So I'd like to thank all of those leaving for their work, and encourage everyone listening to think whether you or maybe someone you know might like to get at least knee deep into this essential work by becoming a trustee, as Jill mentioned earlier. Okay, we're sorry that Hannah Stitfall, who you may already know as a wildlife presenter, has found that her growing work commitments have become too extensive to fit with being a trustee. So she's withdrawn her candidacy, but that's something which we have no difficulty understanding. We've got two new candidate trustees, Mark Woodbridge and Raoul Humphreys. You will have seen their biographies on the webpage for this meeting. They actually have a great range of skills and experience and very much share the values of the trust. We actually have to vote on them individually. So first we will vote on Mark Woodbridge, who's been proposed by Karen Burrows and seconded by Frank Howie. Okay, so that's the poll. While that's running, I just mentioned humpback whales have come up twice earlier. They look like a real conservation success story, possibly increasing their numbers following the end of commercial whaling in the 1980s. Okay, we'll wait for Pete to give us the results of that vote. Okay, so Mark has got 94% yes, 6% abstention, so Mark is duly elected. And the second new trustee is Raoul Humphreys. He's proposed by Fred Curry and seconded by Charlie David. And while that's proceeding, I'd just mention the other cetacean that appeared in the video was orcas. They're a different story. The British orca population is profoundly polluted. We fear it may never manage to produce another baby and may go extinct. But we did see a bottlenose dolphin population on the Tagus in the Sardo estuary in Portugal that looked to be in a similar situation, but then managed to offload enough pollutions to start recovering. Okay, so Raoul has been duly elected with 89% positive and 11% abstentions. Okay, then we have Fred Curry, who is an existing trustee and who's standing for re-election. He's proposed by Jill Saunders and seconded by Dee Reeves. So actually Jill, Fred is a former forester, had a very key conservation role with the Forestry Commission, and he and Jill have both done a huge amount of tree planting in the last year. It's been a very difficult year for young trees to survive, but both of them have got very high survival rates, which is a great credit. And I think Fred's claiming 100%. So if you want good advice on how to plant trees, get in touch with Fred. Okay, so have I gone too fast? Have we seen the results for Fred? Yeah, here they are. 94% in favour, 6% abstentions. So Fred is duly elected. Okay, so at this point, I pass back again to Jill to deal with the appointment of auditors.
Thanks, Nick. This is item 9 on your agenda. At this point, I ask for your agreement to reappoint the auditors. Our auditors are Robinson Reed Leighton, and to reappoint them for the coming year. This is proposed by Frank Howie, seconded by Stafford Sumner, and the vote is up now for you. Thank you. And we have 86% in favour with 14% abstaining, and therefore the auditors are reappointed for the coming year. At this stage, I pass back briefly to Carolyn to ask if there's been any further comments or questions incoming that we haven't picked up.
No further questions or comments in the chat box.
Thank you very much. So we're coming now to the end of the formal business of the day, and I'm going to pass back in a moment to Nick just for some final words before we close down. At this point, I would draw your attention to our exit survey. We'd like to know how we did, how it was for you, and this will come up as we close down at the end. And we'd be very grateful if as many of you as can spare the time would fill that in so that we know how things went today and how you feel about other things like using this format in future. Thank you very much for your attendance and attention today. And I'll hand you back to Nick.
Okay, thanks, Julia. I'd like to echo what Oliver said earlier, and seriously thanking so many people, staff, trustees, members and non-members actually being active in so many ways, whether grappling with policy issues that we've heard about or removing some plastic every time you visit a beach. Thank you. It's really valuable. If you would like to do more, but actually are short of time, it's worth searching for wildlife trusts and 30 by 30 online, because it's 30% of land and sea protected by 2030, but it's also 30 million that the wildlife trusts are hoping to raise, and you can contribute to that campaign. And if it's successful, it will involve massive carbon capture entailed in those achievements. And of course, don't forget to include in your will at least some legacy to CWT or some other body that can give long-term protection to land that will ensure that your someday redundant banknotes are converted into an indefinite supply of bands of tiny, energetic acrobats. I'm talking about long-tailed tits peeping their way through the branches you funded, to the delight of anyone who sees them in the future. I'll leave to your imagination to fill in all the other wildlife that will benefit. And thank you for attending this AGM, which is now ended.